Okay, so I just wanted to explain the next video in the Hacker News. So this is requesting data from an API endpoint. So basically we start here by grabbing our NPI endpoint, and this is the API that we're basically getting. So this is the home directory, and basically all we're getting is the information from the API. And these APIs have different links. So if we go to /news, we get the news. And what we can also notice here is that once we go to the Hacker News official website and we go to news/news, which is also /news, we see that we're getting the same data that Hacker News is getting. So John Moore has died. John Moore has died. So he was actually the founder of Intel, so rest in peace. And we can also get the ask. So if we go here and we go to ask, this is the information that we're getting. Airbnb can charge you anything and there's nothing you can do about it. So if we go here, we can also go ahead and ask, and we get the first one. So Airbnb can charge you anything and there's nothing you can do about it. So that's the same thing for all of these API endpoints. And the end where we're getting these three things is called the path. So what we want to do is we want to be able to go ahead and grab our path, dynamically change it. So if we click new, we get the path of /new, and we want to render the path or the endpoint, the data from the endpoint, depending on which path we're getting from the router.js. So remembering what we did in the router.js, we're basically creating our routes, and we're doing it with Navigo. So we had our new instance here, and our routes is basically going to take the path as the first parameter, which is the home directory, and the page as the second parameter, which is the stories function, which of course we're getting from here. And basically we're going to say for each path, so in page, and we're basically destructuring these objects here so that we can basically use path as path instead of having to say routes.path, which also works. And then we're going to call the router on method. So the router is here, and this is a Navigo method. And the router on method is going to take two parameters. So the first parameter it's going to take is the path. So if we're going to the home directory, that's the path. And the second parameter is going to take in what we want to actually display to the users. So we want to display the page. And since the page is the stories function here, it's going to display what we have in this block of code, which I didn't explain yet. And it's going to take in the path again. So it's going to take in the path of /, and that's basically saying render the stories page where the path is the home directory, or where the path is the new directory, or the ask directory, or the show directory. And at the end, we just resolve it, and that just makes sure it works. So going back here, what we were able to do next was we were able to make a new function called getStories, which is also going to take a path. So async function getStories, and I'll explain why it's an async function in a second here. And we basically called it inside of our stories function, which was also converted to an async function, which I will explain later. What we did next is that we wanted to get the stories depending on which route we're currently in. So if we go here, we said, hey, this function gets stories. If it's the home route, or if the path is equals to the / directory, we want to go ahead and say if is home route. And if this is true, the path is going to be /news. And then this is where we actually went out and fetched the API. So we're basically saying the response is going to equal to an await fetch, because this is returning a promise. So we have to await it. And we basically use the template literals to put the path in here. So now this is equals to the home path. So we then pass the response into a variable called stories. And because this is returning to us a promise, we have to await the response and convert it into JSON object code so that we can receive it through our JavaScript. If not, we won't be able to. And at the end, we went ahead and we returned our stories. So what we'll notice here is that the path changes depending on which path you actually visit. So if is home route is false, we'll move on to is new route. That's false, we move on to is ask route. And if that's false, we move on to is show route. And we don't have the final else because we actually don't need it. If it's not any of these routes, then there's no data or no page to actually load because these are all of our pages already. So when we return stories, we go ahead and we move it up here. And since we return the stories, we need to await the get stories function that we called inside of our stories function. And because we're awaiting it, that means that this actually has to be converted into an async function now. So we did that, and then we put it into a variable called stories. So now stories, if we console.log it, stories is actually just going to be an array of objects containing all of the stories. Like if we go to top, it's going to contain all of the stories that we're getting up here. So Gordon Moore, or the judge decides, which is just the same information from here. So Gordon Moore, and then the judge decides. So now what we're basically saying is has stories is going to be the stories array dot length. And if the length of the array is greater than 0, then has stories is going to be true. And now with our view.innerHTML, which is coming from our export default of our query selector of router outlet, which is just the div connected in our HTML of router outlet. So we're basically saying the inner HTML of this is going to be not has stories, but it's going to take the condition of has stories. And if that condition is true, we're going to take the stories, so all of these objects, or all of the array of objects that I just had up here. So it's going to take all of these, and it's basically going to map. So it's going to iterate over every single element inside of this array. So every single story. And that's resembled by story. And what we're going to do is we're going to JSON.stringify the story. And this basically converts the object into actual strings of objects. So what we'll see here is that if we take it off, we just get object, which that's no use to us right now. And then if the length is, let's say, less than 0, so if it's 0, we're just going to log out no stories, but I doubt that we'll ever really run into that. So going back to our notes, let me make sure I explained everything. Step 5, the async await, we have our paths, and then we have, yep, I think that's pretty much it for the explanation. I'm going to be rebuilding this, but I'm going to use a different API, and I probably won't change up the code too much because I think this code is really easy to understand and it just makes sense. So I kind of want to use this coding style that I'm getting from here, this declarative code instead of imperative code. But that's pretty much it for this explanation. On to the next one, I guess.